Leslie, as the director of the Center for Study of Gender and Conflict, to ask how do you perceive the connection between gender norms and violence?
It's a really interesting question. I want to back up just for a second and say that I really appreciate that immediately in this conversation, we've already opened up the issue of gender as opposed to just thinking about men and women and the roles in which they might play in society, to really thinking about that as a space of contestation, as a space of debate, and as a space where something, as Andrea indicated, it can happen. Some kind of ambiguity or some kind of uncertainty is inserted, and then things go over, as he said, this cliff or start to unravel. So first, I want to just push back a little bit and say that I don't really think much about gender norms as fixed patterns that then lead in some kind of linear way to violence. I don't think that there's always a fixed pattern of this is what men should be or this is what women should be, and then one therefore leads to the enaction of violence against the other. I do see these as space of contest, space of sort of different kinds of discourses and power being enacted by those who can claim to be able to stop and define and say this is what men should be or this is what women should be, right? So I see this as a dynamic sort of space, and I think that that's really important because otherwise I think that we head very quickly down this slippery slope where we start to reinscribe these notions that men are the ones who perpetrate violence against passive women victims of violence, and I think that this is problematic. But that said, and that sort of caution aside, there's certainly a lot of research out there that shows how certain kinds of narratives of masculinity as trying to uphold whether they're values of civilization or whether they're certain kinds of civilization written a certain kind of way, or whether they're writ as sort of masculinist, predatory kinds of values, do lead directly to genocide. I also think, though, that the stories that we tell about women and who women are supposed to be are also directly and closely implicated in violence as well. In the context in which I work most closely as an anthropologist, which is Indonesia, a lot of the narratives that were constructed in order to legitimize and authorize mass violence against, in this case, about 1 million Indonesians who were labeled as communists, had to do with creating this figure of this depraved political woman who was out to destroy society and family and nation through her political activities. So as somebody who violated what were supposed to be these idealized sorts of gender norms as well, too. So I think that also violence flows through that kind of sort of shifting narratives of threat when women step out of place. But I do just want to stress that I think it's really important not to think that somehow there is this rigid notion of gender that therefore leads in some kind of linear way to the perpetration of violence. These are highly contested spaces always when we're talking about gender. And so even the notion of norms, I think I would just want to push back a little bit to say that if there were norms, if they could be stable, then we wouldn't be talking about going over cliffs and these kinds of ambiguities.
I'd just like to make a couple of quick comments in follow-up to a couple of things that Elisa said and one thing Leslie pointed out. I think it's really important to keep in mind that gender never stands alone as a variable. In fact, I've argued that there is no case of genocidal violence that has ever been carried out on the basis of a single variable or ascriptive trait. It is always a blend, and in fact, an understanding of the way gender works in operation with things like age and status is absolutely essential. And part of the analytical challenge in many ways is drawing out the specific gender dimension from these other variables, and it's not always an easy task to do. It was Andrea's comment about the move from latency to actuality. That is almost always a moment of crisis. And it seems to me that it is almost always a moment of gender crisis. It's very interesting to look at those shifts, those crises that move us from latency to actuality, and to see the role that gender plays in and of itself and the way that it is mobilized to play a role. Just as an example of that, what were the implications of the economic crisis in Rwanda for younger Hutu males who could not achieve adult masculinity in the sense of marrying and starting a family until they had achieved a certain material standing and prominence in the society? And how vulnerable did that make that set of males to the appeals of the genocidaire, saying basically, if you join us in killing Tutsis, you can have that Tutsi's house or job or cattle or woman or whatever. Men in that position of crisis were mobilized in a very explicit way and mobilized themselves in explicit ways. From the other side of the gender coin, and I'm sorry to keep talking in this kind of binary way, but what did the economic crisis in Chile mean from 1970 to 73, when we saw an enormous number of women, conservative women, self-identified in their maternal role, taking the extraordinary step of public activism, the banging of pots and pans, and the playing a leading role in the eventual overthrow of the democratically elected government and its replacement by the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. And right up until the very end of Pinochet's time in power, the final plebiscite, more women voted for Pinochet than did men. And I think that has a lot to do with understanding the gendered fears of women who self-identify as mothers and therefore the guardians of subsistence within the family, and feel economic crisis as a challenge to their gender identity, and just like men, for the same reasons in the same crises, are very often willing to follow extremist models. Last comment only, I loved your comment, Leslie, about the way that women often get constructed as subversive because they are moving outside traditionally understood gender roles. And I just think in that context of Klaus Terelite's fantastic study of paramilitary masculinity in early post-World War I Germany, and how the model of the red female became such a mobilizing tool for those really sort of proto-genocidal formations.